There's a lot of games that focus on ideas like crime, war, and purely just violence, but there's something I've noticed about how many of these games stick to those sole ideas and work purely off those foundations. The GTA games, for example, use crime as the sole pivot to what you'll be doing during your time with the games. But aside from the first couple of ones, which didn't really have any substantial story to speak of, the crime actually works as a branching off point for some more varied and arguably more ambitious subjects. Some still focus within the criminal underworld, like corruption within a supposedly well-intentioned government, but others going deeper into human psychology. Using GTA 5 as an example, the main themes we see in that game are ones centered around classism, the idea of age, and the modern day era, where we see characters like Michael and Trevor be almost completely disillusioned with the world surrounding them. I think comparable to the format of motion pictures, many games that appear to be about a certain subject typically end up exploring far more different topics than can be seen on the surface. Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver is a good example, I think. Aside from the title, which doesn't clue you in at all to how disturbing and violent certain scenes in this film are, the core theme would be the character of Travis Bickle and his immense isolation and loneliness. However, with the introduction of characters like Betsy and Iris, we start diving into politics, pimps, and pure psychopathy. This broad approach to tackling numerous themes is presumably down to how these pieces of work are being created not just by talented individuals, but ones who are looking deeper into our society, analysing our culture, and reflecting how this impacts people's lives and their mindsets. The reason I mention this is that this is just one approach for games, and a surprisingly typical one at that, at least in the modern day gaming era. Early titles on consoles like the SNES or PS1 usually didn't have the high writing standards of most games we're getting nowadays, with some exceptions of course going to games like Metal Gear Solid or Abe's Odyssey. And that's perfectly fine, they were still coming out of the arcade era from their transition to home consoles, but it's still important to recognise there's tons of games nowadays that still adhere to this arcadey style. Simulators for one never really have any substantial story to speak of, but that's almost a given. I'm talking more about games that primarily focus on gameplay while still having a key and necessary story to push the game forward, not only interesting those who want to dive deeper into something that could appear simple on the surface but far more complex after some analysis, but also working as a focal point which will keep players interested in a constant progression of a narrative, even if that's one they may not even be the slightest bit invested in. Games like The Binding of Isaac, Dead Cells, or Hades come to mind immediately. They very blatantly have narratives to them, but the devs are also very aware that what most players will be coming back for is the addictive roguelike gameplay. And the game we're looking at today, despite not totally fitting into that roguelike bracket, definitely has a large amount of elements from the games I just mentioned, using them effectively to create a wonderfully intense and unique experience that no other game has quite managed to outclass or even replicate as of yet. And that's the Payday games. Released in October of 2011 and developed by Overkill Software, Payday the Heist has us stepping in the shoes of 4 robbers, those being Hoxton, Chains, Wolf, and their leader, Dallas. Outside of that though, and the crew's handler, Bane, who helps in assisting us with these heists, that's all the story context we're given. There's only 2 games in this series as of yet, with the third one apparently on its way this year. However, it's easy to see that Payday 2 became more ambitious in relation to aspects like the narrative. There's almost nothing tying these heists together, and most definitely no kind of story progression here. What this first game does well, however, is lay an incredibly solid foundation which stands on its own, even despite the wide range of expansions we see in its sequel. Straight away we can see that in our main characters. Personalities aside, which I think will only be distinguishable to those closely familiar with these games, all the masks they're wearing are nothing except iconic. Dallas's with its wide grin and American flag, Wolf's with its sewn up mouth and distinct red and white colour scheme. The design of all these are fantastic, and with the emphasis on these all being clown masks, I can't help but feel there's a certain level of inspiration from films like The Dark Knight, obviously with the opening sequence featuring the Joker's crew also donning clown masks, funny enough also being all focused around a bank robbery. Even in terms of when the game was released, I found the title screen to be rather basic, just being a static image with all the characters, with the list of selections on the right hand side. Here we can see options like playing either online or single player, control and graphic options of course, and also some challenge and upgrade tabs which we'll look into more as we get into the game. When selecting a heist, we can see there's 9 in total to choose from. However, it's important to note that 3 of these were added later as DLC, Counterfeit and Undercover being part of the paid Wolfpack DLC, and No Mercy being a free DLC linked to the Left 4 Dead universe. This means that on release there would have only been 6 heists to choose from, far less than Payday 2's base 12 heists, some of which also feature several different variants, like the different kinds of bank heists, with Payday 2 also eventually featuring all the heists from the original game. It leaves this first one in a strange kind of limbo, where you're realistically only going to be buying this game to experience where the series started from. If you're looking to save money, for example, there's very few reasons I can give to why you should buy this first game in comparison to Payday 2. It's more fleshed out in every aspect, as we'll eventually see. But staying with the first game for now, much like its sequel, I'm not going to be going over every individual heist in this video. There's not only a lot to go through, but also plenty that pretty much reiterate the same structures verbatim. This doesn't mean we'll skip over the general concepts of these heists though. Staying away from comparisons to the sequel, the customization here is still rather limited, which is fine admittedly. There's no extra characters to unlock here, and the only difference in costumes comes in the form of the different masks we can select from, all of which adhere to specific characters. You can't mix and match all the masks between each individual character, for example. And getting into the actual game, we see the unique structure to these heists, which introduces not only two separate ways of handling the job, but also a fantastic rising tension. For a large amount of heists, you'll start off in what's referred to as casing mode, this being a point where you and your team are unmasked and are actively trying to blend into the environment. As the name implies, this is our opportunity to case the joint before going loud, being able to scout the area for certain things like cameras, and perhaps to locate some essential targets or doors that we'll need to enter beforehand, so we have a clearer indication on what to do when things start getting more chaotic. Whilst we're in this mode, we can still be detected by guards and cameras despite an increased amount of resistance, so we still need to be careful and vigilant towards where we move ourselves around the environment. The only thing with the casing mode is that everything outside of observing our environment is locked off. We can't shout at civilians, we can't crouch, we can't jump, and putting our mask on, even whilst in an isolated area with nobody around, will somehow alert everyone of your presence. That means, aside from the diamond heist, which has an emphasis on stealth from the very beginning, there's very few opportunities to handle these jobs in a sneaky fashion this time round, something that will be changed drastically in the sequel. Putting our mask on begins the heist, flashing tons of things on screen in quick succession. So let's analyze the HUD first. In the bottom left, we can see our health bar, as well as our teammates and their locations. I love the appearance of our health bar in this game, having whatever character we're playing as be presented in a small box. However, aside from the nice visual, I wouldn't say it's presented in the most effective way in terms of the gameplay. There's definitely a sense they're emulating Max Payne's health bar here, with a reflection of the character's appearance, along with a bar which lowers depending on how much damage you're taking. This almost being an inverted way of how Max Payne does things. The aspects that aren't as clear would be things like the white outline surrounding our character. This reflects our armor, where getting shot a few times will increasingly lower the white border surrounding our character, until we end up taking real damage, which in turn lowers the green background to the health bar, which will eventually end up turning it red when we're on very low health. My only issue with this would be that the white line surrounding our character is rather thin and hard to pay attention to when things get swiftly hectic, but at the same time is still a key component to be aware of to ensure your survival. Starting off as well, with the base equipment we're given in this game, I also found the health to be rather strict and limiting when it comes to how you'll be playing. I never really felt any opportunity to go all out and mow down the cops. It felt that almost every shot I was giving out I'd also take, with me then having to hide behind any surrounding objects until I recovered. That's somewhat fine. I was never expecting this to be the kind of game Doom is or anything. I'm just referring more to the frustration in some moments of feeling consistently stuck, with no chance to retaliate or move whatsoever. Other elements included within our HUD would be the objectives tab in the top left, where upon pressing tab we're given information like our objectives, our challenges, and also which upgrade we want to focus on next. There's also our location at the top of the screen, our equipment and ammo count in the bottom right, and also how many hostages we have at the bottom. Running through these heists will put all these elements to maximum effectiveness. In moments of calm, you can press tab and refamiliarize yourself with the objectives and challenges that you'd like to pursue. Much like games like CSGO, the location at the top of the screen is primarily helpful when playing in a team, allowing the player to call out their location if they need assistance and the other teammates can't locate them. And of course, the ammo counter. About as basic as you can get, but there's no need for anything fancy here. As you'll find when taking on a large amount of these heists, there's things which get continually repeated throughout, which on the surface may seem like a fairly monotonous cycle, especially with how they're implemented here. But for many players will result in an experience which can feel wildly intense at points, even with nothing substantial happening. This would be things like the drill, which is frequently used to break into safes and doors, and also the assault waves, which rise and fall throughout the entirety of the heist. Talking of those elements, these both link to the gunplay, so let's actually see if there's anything substantial here. And for the most part, I'd ultimately say there isn't really. Let's just say there's not one part of the gunplay that I found to be solely original to the Payday games, while at the same time not featuring any elements of the gunplay that I find to be the most refined compared to other games. It's real bog standard stuff, point and shoot. It's really the elements which surround the gunplay which ends up significantly bolstering it. First off, the enemies are approached from the angle of having different tiers of dangerousness. In terms of regular cops that don't have any other functionality outside of shooting you in the face, there's still an elevation we see to these alone, typically starting off with some kind of security or police officers, and then as things get more severe, you find other types of more heavily armed SWAT teams get sent in, having more dangerous weaponry on top of being more resistant to your shots. That's not it though, those are just the enemies we're seeing most often, and staying in line with our comparisons to Left 4 Dead from earlier, there's multiple special enemy types here which all serve particular functions, which more often than not always have to be handled carefully. Some are still close to being regular enemies with how many get thrown at you. I'm referring to ones like the shield, taser or sniper, all having a more individualized function. The shield shield having majorly increased defense, blocking bullets headed for himself and possibly others. The taser being fairly self-explanatory with how he can lock you in place and tase you, giving other enemies the chance to lay into you at the same time, while featuring the fantastic inclusion of having you manically fire your weapon, which, if you're lucky enough and can locate where the taser is through the numerous visual effects which get flashed on screen, you may have the opportunity to escape yourself without the assistance of your teammates. And also the sniper, which is literally just a sniper that attacks you from a distance, giving out high damage while also being a harder target to hit, but also having the drawback of having a very blatant yellow trail, which makes their shots easier to track and avoid, and also at points simply making it easier to locate them if they're hidden away. But then you've got the two most severe threats, those being the bulldozer and the cloaker. The bulldozer, as you can see, is a Goliath, having incredibly damaging shots, while at the same time being the most resistant enemy we come up against. It really puts the player on their toes whenever he crops up, typically wanting a large amount of distance between you and the guy, or at least some cover, as he's got the tendency to put the pressure on and stomp his way ever closer towards you. And the cloaker is also one that you're wanting to keep a fair distance from, not being as damaging or protected compared to the bulldozer, but featuring the ability to knock you down with a single swift action. The thing with these guys though is that once they enter this state where they're about to knock you down, the sound and visuals work very effectively in informing the player of what's going on. The cloaker sound effect being one that's almost disorientating and distinct compared to any other sound we hear in the game. And also the bright green lights we see turn on as he runs towards us. This gives us a good opportunity to talk about the visuals and sound on a wider scale. The sound in particular being what I perceive as arguably the most pivotal element to raising the stakes of each heist. Visually, the game doesn't have anything too stunning to look at. The environments are all fine, there's not anyone in particular that stands out as being bad at all, and in fact, places like the First World Bank and Slaughterhouse definitely stick out to me as being distinctly Payday, and being designed in a brilliant way which gives them both authenticity and unique functionality. The Slaughterhouse, for example, features all these hanging bodies of meat, which not only makes for a unique environment, but also doubles as being our primary form of cover. The bank's the same in this regard, although it focuses more on the authenticity side that I mentioned, still having a nice two-floor design with plenty of balconies which overlook entrances, so we can take out the incoming police. But unlike Slaughterhouse, outside of the structural design, there's nothing which sticks out as unique in this one particularly, at least not for me. It's not vital, just something I noticed. Most of the texture work would have likely looked great at the time. Not top of the line of course, much like its sequel, but still having things like weapons, the enemies and the surrounding environment look good. This goes for the effects as well, with all the enemies' weaponry viciously shooting out with a flash of light, also being able to see the bullets travel through the air towards us so we can perhaps gauge the general pattern of where they're shooting in relation to us. The blood effects look good enough, no kind of gore or dismemberment system to be seen here, but enough of a bloodbath to appropriately reflect the action that's taking place. Effects like the smoke are genuinely brilliant in their functionality, working as a thick and layered hindrance between you and your enemies, and also aspects like how we fire and reload our weapons, the feedback we get from them while firing, and the hand gestures that are employed when interacting with our teammates all look great too. On the sound side of things though, this is where the game starts to really excel, as the sound is definitely one of the elements I think Payday does genuinely do a lot better than most other games I play. I think the sound effects of weapons like the Amcar and Rhinebeck are lacking a punch. They just sound too much like a stock sound you could hear anywhere. Where things really start coming into their own though is when things go loud, with numerous sound cues which play frequently, which makes us aware that we're either progressing nicely or we're in for some trouble. Sounds which I've mentioned before, like the taser or cloaker enemies. The almost crushing impact that we hear, not just when getting shot, but when getting shot without any armor. And the most prominent of which being the music, which ramps up immensely as we enter an assault wave. Throughout the heist, there's peaks and troughs that we'll be continually experiencing until the job's done, the main one being the assault waves we frequently see crop up, just being a period of time where enemies are getting thrown at you at a far greater pace. In terms of the gameplay, this already works very well, feeding into the intensity and also the balance of the scenario significantly, with how every wave we fend off feels like yet another step in the right direction, giving us a short period after to recuperate. But what I was initially referring to is the music, which is so brilliantly merged with the actions taking place alongside it, that it really feels like a dynamic soundtrack which is actively adapting to all the outcomes that are taking place. The elevation it presents is apparent right from the casing mode, being quiet and largely absent of any instrumentation, but also featuring a high tempo, almost cluing us into the fact things aren't going to be staying this calm in the very near future.
There's to the right.
Find the bag manager, then tie him down or shoot him and you'll get the key card.
Then when starting the heist, you'll notice the music will remain largely unchanged. Well, that's until we get to the assault wave, where no matter what map you're playing on or what track's playing, always sees the track launch into something far more intense and loud. As I said, reflecting the situation you're in very well. And it's funny we mention the assault waves, as for the most part, the whole game basically works on the idea of waves, as you find out in the game's sequel, which features way more variation in terms of the heists. Even then, you discover that for as different as they can initially appear, somewhere along the way you end up waiting for something. Whether it be a drill or an escape vehicle, the game's definitely pushed towards the idea of keeping you stranded at points, with no other option than to knuckle down and fend off against the incoming police. Whilst waiting for something like a drill, a piece of equipment that I really enjoyed in the most hateful way possible, with how the timer and progress bar is immediately shown off when placing it down, serving as an instant panic-inducing moment when you realise how long this thing's going to take. You're likely also not just going to be sitting around and shooting, but instead working with other mechanics to set yourself up for any potential things that might go wrong in the future. The first thing you might want to start doing is tying up hostages, something that can only be done after first yelling at them to get on the ground with the interact key, and then once they're on the ground, also tying them up with the interact key. You'll find that key is arguably the most multi-purpose I've ever experienced in a game. These hostages can be used as bargaining power in case one of your teammates were to get imprisoned during the heist, which can happen if they don't get revived in time, with each subsequent time they go down, giving the player both less health and less time to be revived. This encourages the player to avoid going down at all costs, with there being many instances in the past where attempting to revive someone who's in a bad situation will either lead to them inevitably dying or having the whole team go down with them. As I said though, if this happens, it's not the end of the world. If you've got some hostages saved up, within a fairly short time period, you'll be able to trade one of these to get your teammate back. And with civilians usually becoming increasingly uncommon as the heist goes on, it puts more emphasis on your initial actions when starting the heist, ensuring the civilians both don't escape and also that they're tied up. The rescue of these civilians being something this first game reminds you of constantly, to the point where it almost becomes frustrating. Something else you might find yourself doing while waiting around is targeting the security cameras. These initially present the threat of being discovered while in the casing mode, although when going loud, they then take on a new purpose of giving the police further intel of your heist. That's how it's said in game at least, but in terms of the actual gameplay, the effects of destroying these vary from map to map, and ultimately aren't as impactful as the game paints out. What most people, and I personally believed, was that destroying these would in turn affect things like the assault waves, and the amount of enemies that would be thrown at us. But according to the heavily detailed and seemingly wholly reliable Payday wiki, this is apparently not the case at all for this game, only having specific effects for each map that features cameras. For example, in the bank job, you'll discover that destroying the cameras will lead to less enemies spawning out of the elevators inside the vault. Still useful enough to not completely ignore the cameras, but nowhere near as important as characters like Bane initially paint out. As a whole, whether you're waiting for a drill to complete, ordering a VIP to move his way through a war zone, or making a sneaky excursion to snatch a diamond, I think the first Payday still holds up quite well on its own. While it doesn't present much in the way of a story or a wide variety of maps and modes to play with, because of elements like how enjoyable the gameplay cycle is, something which is even more enjoyable obviously due to the clear encouragement to not just play single player, but to play with your friends online. I could imagine this game for lots of people would be like an itch that can't quite get scratched anywhere else. You can make comparisons to games like Left 4 Dead, and they would be substantiated to a certain degree, but it's the idea of being a ragtag group of robbers that are causing a huge amount of destruction which makes it unique to me. Unlike lots of games, we're in no way being painted out as the good guys. Even aspects like killing civilians is only reflected negatively in a gameplay sense because it means there'll be more of a delay between trades. One of the more vital aspects that puts more focus on the gunplay and your aim, compared to most other times where you can ultimately spray your weapon wherever and still deal some decent damage. What I think would have kept people playing at the time is the reputation system, which leads to the bulk of the upgrades we see here. Being good enough and definitely promoting the idea of replay value, but in my opinion being majorly outdone in its sequel. This is because of aspects like how strict the progression actually is, something that is still present in the updated version we see in the sequel, but nowhere near as much as we see here. First off, I really don't like how the progression is integrated. It's not like we get skill points that we can spend on each of the 4 trees, something which I found to be rather tedious in practice, while at the same time still understanding the vision of having players put more focus on individual roles, so that if they were to play in a group, the team could hopefully organise between each other so that each member has a set purpose. Along these paths, you can also unlock things like new weapons, extra equipment like the trip mines and sentry guns, and also upgrades to our pre-existing equipment, on top of things like extra cable ties and increased body armor. Understand that when I make comparisons to the sequel, I'm not judging the base game. At the time, I'm sure this would have been good enough to keep people playing on for a while, as it creates an incentive which encourages players not only to learn each heist to its maximum potential, so jobs can be done more efficiently, but with the variety of difficulty modes we have, ranging from easy to overkill 145 plus, all featuring varying types of dangerous threats depending on which mode you choose, which in turn ends up giving you larger XP rewards when completing them. This kind of stuff, and the challenges which can be completed alongside these to earn even more XP, seemed engaging enough on its own to me. It's only in retrospect where you can start making judgments on how this stuff could be improved in the future, and realistically, these things would have been apparent before the sequel was even in development. With this game being so focused around robberies and cash, why don't we get the opportunity to actually put it to use? I understand cash is basically being used as XP in this game, but it makes our actions seem somewhat void, as none of the cash we're actually acquiring can be freely used by us, perhaps genuinely in a skill tree like I mentioned earlier, or maybe the purchase of new weapons and equipment. And I'll be honest, although the challenges will definitely promote a sense of replay value, they essentially emulate achievements, which I'm also not the biggest fan of. When I personally am playing a game, it's almost an unwritten rule in my mind that unless I'm playing something for analysis purposes, I'll likely be missing out on some of the game's functionalities, purely because my playstyle doesn't cater to them. The trip mines in this game, for example, I'd usually never use, but I found myself using them solely because I know if I didn't, I'd be uninformed about an aspect of the game. It might not sound essential, but I like to be clued into all mechanics, even the most minor ones if possible. What I'm saying is that putting myself into the shoes of someone who's not as invested into all that kind of stuff as I am, I can't imagine that anyone apart from completionists will actually be trying to complete all of these challenges, because of how specific some of them are. I feel there could have been another mechanic put in place besides these achievement-based unlocks, which could give an XP boost outside of solely completing heists. Overall though, I found the Foundation's Payday the Heist sets up to be very strong. Almost all of the elements we see in this game get carried over to the sequel in some form, although in a lot of instances we'll see that oftentimes these elements have been reworked to create a more satisfying experience all round. Coming into Payday 2, released only 2 years after the first game, we saw a grand expansion from the base game to begin with. From the outset, we could see there's now 12 heists to choose from, compared to the previous game's 6. Leveling up the skill trees no longer worked off the more linear progression of the previous game, now featuring actual skill points which can be invested into one of the 5 roles. These roles now also having even more personalization and vital elements which distinguish each of them. And arguably one of the biggest changes we saw off the bat was in relation to our money, which I think in many ways restructured the entire experience of how these heists are carried out. Bear in mind, we're not actually looking at the base game here. What you're looking at is the most up-to-date version of the game at the time of this video's release. And needless to say, almost everything has been expanded. Weapons, heists, balancing, literally everything. That means that unlike the first game, which in all honesty was basically left in the dust when Payday 2 came around, we've got literal years of expansion and refinement. So I'm gonna stay away from any critical comparisons to the first game for the most part, as it just feels unfair. Starting in the menus then, we can now see everything is now more dynamic and atmospheric in terms of the menu itself, with smoke and burnt cash flowing around. On the left hand side is your character, once again serving as a nice visual, while at the same time reminding you of things like what kind of weaponry you're carrying, and what mask or outfit you're wearing, things you might want to possibly change before going into a lobby. Beside this is a very convenient collection of stats, marking down things like how much cash you've got, what level you're at, and if you've got any skill points that haven't been spent yet. Not essential once again, but definitely appreciated. Having this all presented in the first screen we see when opening the game once again lets us in on where we got up to last time we played. We of course have the options to play online and offline like before, now presenting the idea of crime.net, not being a static screen where we simply select what heist we want to do, although that still being an option with the contract broker, but instead a screen which dynamically presents a variety of heists from the game with different difficulty settings to boot. I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of this was. I feel like if I was to try have a guess, it would likely be something to do with encouraging players to experiment more with jobs and difficulties they may not have attempted yet, which for a game with so many jobs is a fine inclusion. In terms of our new inventory tab, here we can pick and choose things under 3 categories: character, weapons, and abilities. The character tab features the options to first select your player character, this choice now being separate from whatever mask you want to wear. The best way to play Payday 2 nowadays isn't to buy the base game, but instead the Legacy Collection, which features all the essential DLCs, meaning new maps, weapons, unlockables, and also characters and masks. The range of characters is brilliant, everything from the original crew to John Wick to Scarface, all of which feature their own individual perk decks, which we'll talk about in a sec. All these characters of course have their unique appearances, but also all have their own original voice lines, an aspect of the player customization that will likely matter more to solo players, considering they can't see and can't even show off the mask they're wearing. I like the increased amount of freedom we see here with this stuff. We're not locked to a set of 4 characters, and even though all these characters do have their own masks, we're not forced to wear them when selecting the character. The masks in themselves all look really good for the most part, some of these being DLC once again, but also a lot of these being unlockable and purchasable within the game itself. Much like the characters, whatever you pick here will only be based on personal taste. There's no advantages or disadvantages to wearing certain masks, but I will say the variety of mask types we see here is once again great. Even though there is a set number of variants, I never once felt like there wasn't any options that would cater to my taste. Another reason why having a broad range of costumes is important is also for online play, having less overall chance of stumbling into a player that has the exact same character, mask, and outfit as you, making your experience feel even more individual and personalized. Then we've got things we're a bit more used to, things like armor and equipment. These of course being even further expanded to feature different and more effective pieces that you can take into your jobs. The armor, for example, isn't just a base item that can be upgraded over time like in the first game, but instead has several different levels of armor armor to wear, going all the way from a two-piece suit to an improved combined tactical vest. On the surface, the choice may seem obvious. More protection would surely be the only reasonable option to pick, but that's ignoring a vital element of this game which we'll look at when getting into the gameplay, which may dissuade some players from choosing this more powerful armor. Equipment, of course, features all the ammo and medic bags we used in the first game. The inclusion of these for the series as a whole, I should mention, further gives each player their own individual purpose, being the case for the first game, and arguably even more here due to the wider range of equipment. This, of course, only really being the case for online play too, due to the fact that when you're playing solo, your AI teammates never have this kind of equipment. On top of things like sentry guns, trip mines, and doctor bags, which we've seen before, we've got different versions of these pre-existing types, like first aid kits, which with certain skills I found to be an even more effective single-use version of the medic bags. And then we've just got some straight-up new equipment, like the ECM jammer, which can do things like jam camera systems and quietly unlock ATMs, and also a body bag case, which plays into the much improved stealth elements of the game by giving us more body bags to hide bodies. We'll talk about weapons when getting into the game, so the last thing we should focus on here is the abilities category. Starting with the skills, this is exactly the type of system I wanted compared to the first game's upgrade system. Now when completing heists, you're potentially going to be given three separate things: XP, cash, and some continental coins. XP and cash is a given when completing a job, now being two completely different currencies, where XP levels you up and in turn gives you skill points, and cash giving you the ability to buy things like new weapons, weapon slots, throwables, and masks. These skill points can be invested in the 5 different skill trees, and I really like how this system's laid out. The max level we can get to before we're not given out any more skill points is 100, where we'll then have 120 points to spend. Not only can these be spent very efficiently, being given the chance to respec whenever we want, letting us have the option to take on different playstyles without any particular hindrances, but also because we only have 120, it's quite literally impossible to level up everything. In fact, if we decide to double down and ace some of these abilities, we won't even be anywhere close to having everything. This would seem like it puts a lot of weight on our choices here, and to some degree it does. I will say for a lot of the abilities, I found that just having the base version serves their purpose fine enough, bearing in mind that deciding to ace them means spending double the points, and as the different tiers of these skill trees cost increasing amounts of skill points anyways, this means you might be spending a total of 12 points on a singular skill if you're investing in some of the top ones. It's great stuff in my opinion, as the choices we make within this skill tree typically have a pretty substantial impact somewhere along the line, whether it be unlocking the ability to hold up to 14 first aid kits, somewhat making the doctor bag look pointless in comparison, or racing the Iron Man skill to get the best body armor in the game. I personally found the choices to both be varied, impactful, and dependent on the player to pick choices that personally cater to their playstyles. There's also a similar kind of thing we see in the perk deck, but I didn't find this to be as important, to be honest. This is because I found there was a slight bit too much crossover here, which the skill trees don't have. I'm talking about things like the 4th, 6th, and 8th upgrades, where no matter what deck you're working with, you're given the exact same upgrade, lessening the impact of which deck you decide to choose. This is worsened by the fact that whereas the ones I just mentioned are exactly the same, there's also many other ones which basically serve the same purpose too, but are simply more or less effective depending on the deck. Still stuff that you want to be investing in, as they will genuinely give you a booster in your jobs, and it's still a choice that you want to actually be paying close attention to. Reading down certain decks reveals some more unique abilities, like the showdown ability for the sociopath deck, which has the potential to launch enemies into a panic, or right to the top for the kingpin deck, where you gain 40% more health. But ultimately, I also found while experimenting around with these decks, even going from one which is leveled up quite significantly to one that isn't leveled up at all didn't end up affecting my playstyle or how the jobs are carried out. Now, finally getting into the game, we can either decide to take a job on the crime.net page, the contract broker, or the career page. Don't be fooled by the name. The career is literally just a selection of jobs played out in a certain order. There's still no kind of cutscenes to be seen here, although I can no longer say there's no kind of story. It's not a blatant one like a lot of other games. I've seen videos that are hours long laying out the events which take place, purely because the style of portraying these events is rather unconventional, and to be honest, despite never completing the game myself, in most cases I've heard the connecting of the events is actually quite sloppy, so I'm not sure following this confusing storyline is even all that necessary anyways. There is an actual ending to this game, albeit one that gets unlocked after one of the most convoluted and secret processes I've ever seen in a game, including Call of Duty Zombies Easter eggs, which for me is right up my alley, despite never doing it up to this point, although in terms of an actual satisfying and accessible conclusion, there's not much to be seen. Starting with the selection of heists we have here, we've got everything from blasting through Tony Montana's mansion, to making our way through the White House, to just standard bank jobs and mall crashing. Something I realised is that there's enough different scenarios to cater to most players. You might be in the mood to go on a grandiose multiple day operation, or you might just want a quick job to earn a bit of cash and XP, or to try out some new weapons and equipment. Much like the first game, we start off in the casing mode, being relatively the same thing, where we can hardly do anything except observe our surroundings, and perhaps have some job-specific interactions with some NPCs. But now you'll see that when putting on your mask in a secluded area, things won't go loud straight away. This is because of the far improved stealth mechanics in this game, something that was hardly touched on in the first, and even when it was, had big issues due to it not being fleshed out properly. The one heist in the first game that utilised stealth was the diamond heist, which I didn't have a good time with due to there being no sort of indication of how far enemies could detect you from, and how close they were to spotting you. Here, we see in both casing mode and when stealthing, there's a brand new awareness meter that will come up on screen when we're being picked up by enemies or the cameras. This is where it becomes important that you've planned beforehand what kind of approach you're taking. As if you're planning to stealth the job, you can't be taking in things like very protective body armor or intense weaponry, as these ramp up the stat known as concealment. The higher the stat is, the easier it is for any of our threats to spot us, which also applies to the casing mode. It might sound like it's easy from that point on. You want to stealth, use less powerful and quieter equipment. You want to go loud, use the intense stuff. But then you've got to question how effective you think you are at handling it in a quiet fashion. You can always restart, but imagine you're playing on a difficulty like Overkill or the brand new, even harder Death Sentence. You could stealth a large part of the heist only to get caught, where restarting might seem like you're losing too much progress. Although at the same time, due to your lack of substantial equipment, you might end up dying anyway. I love that kind of dynamic, but the stealth itself is rather basic in how it's handled, basically boiling down to your typical Far Cry detection meter for most things. This means standing in front of guards and cameras for too long will lead to them eventually discovering you, something the detection meter actually makes apparent this time round, both in relation to where they're spotting you from and how long it is until your cover's completely blown. The stealth option in these heists can both be effective in terms of completing the heist without the risk of being wiped out by the incredibly tough assault waves, making certain heists almost essential to complete quietly on the highest difficulties, and also the extra bonuses that can be acquired by tackling the heist in a way that requires more time and consideration towards your actions. You're not only having to avoid being spotted, but other elements of discovery comes from things like losing control of civilians, who in turn will run off and get the police, not answering the pages of the guards you kill, which will also end up sounding the alarms. The stealth, in my opinion, hits a pretty perfect balance, where on the surface it might seem fairly manageable, but on execution presents numerous threats the player has to cleverly get past to stay quiet. These are threats that can also be avoided more easily when taking into consideration the pre-planning which can be done before most of these heists. Typically, this means spending some cash and a certain amount of favors, which can be seen in the top left, mainly for things like camera access, keycards, or ammo drops for some assistance during the heist. Although with some heists, like the Golden Grin Casino, you get a full-on pre-planning tab, where there's quite a lot of options in relation to speeding up the heist, and just making it an easier time. For example, you could enter either quiet or loud, or choose to enter loud with C4 to make a dangerous impact immediately. You could also delay the alarms to give you more time to prepare if you get spotted, and even spend out to get further optimizations for the drill we'll be using, so we can get the job done faster. I wouldn't say any of this stuff will make or break the heist. It still all relies on you playing well to achieve completion, but it definitely presents a freedom once again, on top of being genuinely helpful in its assistance. On the other hand though, going loud is relatively similar to what we saw in the first game. As I said before, everything's still based on waves, from waiting on drills to fending off assault waves. Minor changes that are made here in terms of the sound design feed into this element very well. The sound the drill now makes, for example, when having to be reset, is one that's forever linked with imminent danger in my mind. Interacting with objects like the drills is still quite similar too, holding the interact button for a period of time until the action is complete, with the only difference being the switch from a progress bar to a circle, still serving the same purpose though ultimately. This approach is one that I'm not too sure I'm a fan of though honestly, which is something I've gone back and forth on throughout my years of playing this game. On one hand, there are moments like when you're carefully stealthing around and lockpicking doors where this mechanic is wonderfully tense, solely down to how long it takes to complete some of these things. Same goes for when things are loud, being pummeled by tons of bullets while praying for the circle to be complete just a bit faster. But there are also moments where it's nothing except strenuous to wait for, and with how often this gets employed to some of these heists, there might be moments where it feels like all you're doing is holding the interact button and waiting. When you are going guns blazing though, the action is even more intense than last time, helped along with some vital improvements to elements like the balancing between your team and the amount of incoming enemies. You'll find in Payday 2 that depending on what skills you've invested in and what equipment you're carrying on you, there will be moments where you might feel simply unstoppable, even on difficulties like Overkill. I found the enemies here don't give out as much damage with their singular shots, removing what I found to be a slightly tedious element of the first game, where it seemed like everything was a red light green light process of staying down whenever you got shot. Don't get me wrong, the damage can still definitely build up rapidly, something which can be significantly amplified with the return of the special enemies, most of which return with the same functionalities, but also having some new ones and some reworkings to the older ones. This would be things like the snipers now having a red laser beam, so you can more easily locate them and preemptively dodge their shots. Newer enemy types though would be things like the US Marshal, which is basically another buffed up normal enemy with the ability to either blind you with his shield variant or snipe you with his sharpshooter variant. Then you've got the medic, who heals the surrounding enemies that he's close to. And then a couple more interesting inclusions in the form of turrets and Captain Winters. The turrets, as you could assume, are durable pieces of machinery that crop up either in the form of roof turrets, which reveal themselves after the alarms start ringing, or police turrets, which are equipped to vehicles like the helicopter or SWAT vans, with these being yet another highly damaging obstacle, and one that can't be taken out all that easily. It's something else which halts the player in their tracks, much like Captain Winters, who ends up halting fighting the assault wave until he's taken out, presenting a new spin to the waves by not making them time-based but instead kill-based. And as per usual, the way you're going to be dealing with all these threats is the weapons, with Payday 2 featuring a magnificent arsenal of weaponry for us to use. This is where the bulk of your money will be spent, not just on the weapons, but also the tons of useful attachments they have to offer. These aren't just given to you when you have the correct amount of funds, but also work off the leveling system, although once you reach around level 50, almost all of the weaponry is given to you to buy, with the only exceptions being ones that are either locked behind challenges or DLC. With there being everything from LMGs to akimbo pistols here, you can naturally assume there are tons of builds that you're able to put together, some which will be more effective for things like stealth, and others which will be better for going loud. If you're someone like me who gets somewhat bemused at the intricacies of these guns, you'll likely find yourself going towards weapons that are both powerful and have lots of ammunition, which means more often than not I'm using something like an LMG. It mitigates not only the threat of being unable to effectively kill my enemies, but also ammo concerns, which can get genuinely dire at points. The weapons here all have quite reasonable price points in my opinion. A lot of the very good weapons you aren't going to be acquiring right off the bat, and some are locked off via the leveling system anyways to ensure the progression isn't completely screwed. I will say though, whereas I am appreciative of the sheer detail that's been poured into the big arsenal of weaponry, I feel like because there's a hierarchy, a lot of these have gone to waste for me. Call me ignorant if you want, I'm not going to try say that I know all the ins and outs of this game. There's whole channels dedicated to things like weapon builds for Payday 2. But for me, if I've got the option to purchase a singular weapon that can do everything a less effective weapon can only do with attachments, I don't know why I'd ever buy or use the less effective weapon in that case. The only instance I can understand people doing this is either if they want to experiment, which is fair game, and also if they quite literally can't acquire the better weaponry. For example, I more often than not use the Judge shotgun for my secondary weapon because of its sheer damage, but I wanted to see what another one of these shotguns did, and by using the Goliath shotgun with explosive rounds, I found it was almost completely useless for the difficulty mode I was on. This is where I get confused. I feel like I'm doing something wrong, but nothing's actually pointing in that direction in terms of the mechanics. And not to mention, this also brings a repercussion in terms of the gameplay, a brilliant new addition being the idea of the bags. Unlike the first game, which simply used the robbery of things like cash as an objective checkbox, filling bags up which you never even pick up, but simply disappear and are only implied to have been taken away with you. This has now been turned into a full-blown mechanic, where you'll have to carry bags one at a time for a multitude of purposes. In the beginning, this could be things like the thermal drill we need to drag into the bank heist, but once we've got access to whatever cash or drugs we're heading after, we have to bag them up and take them out. In a multiplayer group, this will be fairly self-explanatory. One per person means you'll hopefully be chipping in with one of these on your back, and taking it to whatever extraction point there is. On single player though, their AI can make things slightly more difficult. Much like most things, they're not going to help you out along the way, which includes no lockpicking, no bagging up items, quite literally nothing except shooting enemies and reviving you. The one thing they do help with is carrying bags however, although this does present yet another potential threat. In terms of their movement, their pathing can sometimes be strange, and with the bags you'll find that certain items are able to be moved quickly, with you being able to do all your normal functions like running and jumping. But some more heavy loads like weaponry and big bags of cash will in turn restrict your movement, difficult enough for the player alone, but being even worse for your AI teammates, who end up walking incredibly slowly. I won't get on the AI's back that much to be honest, it's not like it's anywhere near broken. It definitely ends up functioning more consistently than many other AI systems I've witnessed before this. It's just yet another thing that works as a clear disadvantage compared to the multiplayer. Back to the bags however, these not only pose an incentive to make the most out of these heists, by making them a dynamic element compared to the past game's reliance on having them solely as an objective. Fact is, you get paid for completing the contract regardless, so if you're required to steal a certain amount of loot, you could reasonably take that stuff out and leave immediately. Or during certain heists, you might end up stealing nothing at all. The fact these bagged rewards have now been made an optional element, on top of having other smaller goodies hidden around each map, which can be picked up whenever with no kinds of movement penalties to speak of. They introduce a fantastic risk-reward element. As I just said, you don't necessarily need to steal any more than what's required, but staying behind and taking everything you can will lead to even more assault waves, more risk of dying, and in general, more risk of failure. Both from the fact we're rewarded with even more cash and XP, but at the same time not putting an end to the addictive chaotic action. By the end of all this analysis of Payday's mechanics, it should become clearer why this is a series that's been continually played and replayed as time goes on. It's beside the types of games like CSGO and Rainbow Six Siege in my mind, where there's something that keeps drawing players back, and as the game seemed to reciprocate with some of the in-game dialogue, it could be as simple as the buzz of pulling off a grandiose heist successfully. These are games that work primarily off gameplay. If you're someone who isn't bothered with a lack of story content, it's almost inevitable that you end up having a fun time with either of these two games. The visuals are good, the mechanics are solid, if slightly repetitive in some spots, and with a large variety of customizable aspects including weaponry, appearances, skill sets, and difficulty settings, there's reason to say that your first experience with this game may appear entirely different to future playthroughs, as you become more familiar with the game as a whole and figure out what's the best equipment and approaches to take in certain scenarios. Remember, that's not to say there's no story content to speak of however, as you could see with some of the incredibly obscure secrets we can discover in this game after after completing certain heists. This is a game packed with lore, a key and big difference towards a game that has a focused and in-your-face narrative. If you want to learn more about the events taking place, the people you're working for, and the characters' stakes in all this, you likely will find that with a certain amount of research and discovery, because it's all there to be seen. It's just the fact you've got to search for it yourself, as the game never ends up enforcing the story for you. You could play these heists for hours on end and still not figure out there's anything linking them, especially if you stayed firmly away from the career mode. The RPG elements the second game introduced I found to be satisfying, with my only issues coming from elements that come from playing in the long run. I'd say your first 50 hours or so will be a more than enjoyable experience, double, maybe triple that time if you're playing with friends. But then when peeling back other layers of the game, we can realise at points it can be very buggy. The difficulty spikes between modes like Overkill, Mayhem and Death Sentence are damn near broken, and I'm not even going to start on the loot drops. Let's just say, compared to naturally getting additional attachments and paint jobs for your weapons via leveling up, they instead decide to implement a random drop at the end of each heist, selecting one of 3 cards and getting different rewards in turn. They reroute this somewhat with some of the DLC. The Gauge mod drops introduce packages around each map to unlock additional and even better attachments than the ones which can be received from the RNG drops. But that's something else you won't receive if you only buy the base game, with almost every fan of Payday 2 saying DLC packs like this one should have just been put in for everyone. Payday the Heist and Payday 2 were 2 games that in no way do I find to be groundbreaking landmark games, which innovate on aspects which no other game has dared to try. But the areas it chooses to tackle were definitely handled with a high amount of consideration to numerous aspects of the player's experience. Payday 2 in particular. As we see, they want players to feel a buzz from all these heists, whether that be sneaking your way through a highly secured compound or blasting your way into the White House. Because of elements like the sound, visuals, and all-round escalation of these heists, pretty much every single one has some great action to offer. As some of these jobs show off, the gameplay can oftentimes be so engaging that the game will still have your full attention, even if you're just sat in the same corner for 5 minutes straight. For people looking to get into the Payday games, unless you're really wanting to see where the series started from, I recommend you start directly with Payday 2. Over time, they've ended up putting all of the heists from the first game in anyways, and with the improved and expanded mechanics that are on offer, you'll likely have an overall more enjoyable experience with the sequel. As I said earlier, I look at Payday like an itch which can't quite get scratched by any other gaming experience, and if you're willing to put up with some of the blatant pitfalls which can be seen here, such as the sloppy AI, annoying RNG drops, lack of any obvious narrative, and admittedly a gameplay loop that will be cumbersome and repetitive for some, there's some genuinely fantastic moments to be had here, and with the variety and freedom Payday 2 presents in so many more aspects than the first game, it's no wonder that I've seen people spending upwards of 4,000 hours with this game. So, in conclusion, due to its fairly low price point nowadays and definite potential to become an addictive favourite for many players, I think Payday, much like your CSGOs, Gmods and TF2s, is a series that should at least be experienced once by most gamers. It's just a matter of if the game can keep your attention for the long term, which will result in you really getting the most of what's on offer here.